Have you ever heard of a building known as Spite House? In his book Mistreated, author Ron Lee Davis tells the true story of a millionaire who in the late 1800s owned a lot in an exclusive residential area of New York City. This lot presented an unusual problem. It was only a couple of yards wide by nearly 100 feet long. There was nothing he could really do with such an oddly proportioned piece of real estate but sell it to one of the neighbors on either side. He went first to the neighbor on the east side of the lot and asked him if he was interested in buying it. And the neighbor said, "Well, only as a favor." Then he named a ridiculously low price. The millionaire exploded. Why, that's not even 1/10 of what the lot is worth, he said. He stormed out and went to see the neighbor on the west side. To his dismay, the neighbor on the west side bettered the previous offer by only a few dollars. "Look," the neighbor said smugly, "I've got you over a barrel. You can't sell that lot to anyone else, and you can't build on it. So there's my offer. Take it or leave it." The millionaire was beside himself with rage. Within a few days, he hired an architect and a contractor to build one of the strangest houses ever conceived. Only 5 feet wide by 4 stories tall and running the full length of the property, this house was little more than a row of tiny little rooms, each barely able to accommodate a single stick of furniture. The neighbors complained that the bizarre structure would blight the neighborhood and block light from reaching their homes, but city officials could find no regulations to disallow it. When it was finished, the millionaire moved into his very uncomfortable and impractical house, and there he stayed until his death. The house on the corner of Lexington Avenue and 82nd Street became known as Spite House and stood as a monument to one man's anger. Could you imagine living your whole life so miserably just out of anger and bitterness? It seems hard to believe. And yet, sad to say, many people do exactly this very thing in their own way every single day. Yeah. I wonder how many of us here today are living in our own spite house. Right? Let's face it, as flawed human beings, we are constantly hurting each other. And these injuries and anger are the source of much of our pain on any given day, as well as the core of some of the most profound brokenness in our lives overall. The ability to get beyond this, to forgive, thus obviously being a central skill of life, a crucial skill really, yet it is often just so incredibly difficult. What are we to do? Well, this is precisely what Jesus is discussing in our text today. Forgiveness, learning how to let go of and move beyond anger and injury. In our reading this morning, in our continuing study of Jesus' parables, Peter comes to Jesus with a question. "Master, if a member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive them? As many as 7 times? Peter has been hurt by someone very close to him, and he's wondering what to do. And notice, it is a church member who has done this. Imagine that. Right? Church members who don't always get along. Church members who actually don't even like each other. Right? Imagine that. Right? Well, the religious teachers of the day said that 3 times was the standard for forgiving someone. Peter has pushed beyond this to the perfect biblical number of 7, doubling the common standard and adding 1, figuring this should be more than enough, even for Jesus' often extremely extreme demands, But Jesus answers, not 7 times, but 77 times, or as some translate it, 70 times 7 times. His point being not a literal, forgive somebody 77 or 490 times, and then you can be done with them, then you can tell them to kiss off, right? Like you're keeping a ledger. But rather, forgiveness so beyond any normal expectation, so repeated, that it just becomes a way of life. Jesus is then telling a parable, the parable of the unforgiving servant, to illustrate this principle. There was a king whose slave owed him a tremendous amount of money. The king was about to throw the servant into prison because of this, when the servant pleaded for mercy, and the king, moved by pity, absolved the debt. But this servant, upon leaving the palace, came upon one of his friends who owed him just a little bit of money. The servant demanded the money, and when the friend couldn't pay, he had him thrown into prison. When the king heard of this, he was outraged and had the servant thrown into jail because he hadn't shown the same mercy that he had just received. The point of the parable being not only that having been forgiven so much he should have been forgiving, but even more that the absence of forgiveness results in imprisonment, right? As the story itself ends with the servant in jail being tortured with the tagline, "Such it is for all who do not forgive." That is, when we don't forgive, we become locked away in suffering. Life is kept from us. Forgiveness is the key to life, the very key to life. As Jesus makes clear, if you are not forgiving, you block yourself off from life. You cannot receive God's forgiveness. The two are tied. This not in the sense that God simply, does whatever we do. If we forgive others, God forgives us. If we don't forgive others, God doesn't forgive us. No. God's love is not tied to our actions. Rather, it's simply that when we refuse to forgive, we effectively say some things are beyond forgiving, and thus effectively block ourselves from receiving God's forgiveness, which is always offered. We are kept from the source of life. As it has been said, the world's worst prison is the prison of an unforgiving heart. If we refuse to forgive others, then we are only imprisoning ourselves and causing our own torment. An unforgiving spirit is the mark of an unforgiven spirit, which is therefore the mark of an unforgivable spirit. You can be theologically and morally upright, but if you do not have a forgiving spirit, you are spiritually bankrupt. Forgiveness is the key of life. If you cannot forgive, you cannot live. If you will not forgive, you are not a Christian, no matter what you say. It's the very heart of our faith, right? So how do we go about doing this? Well, I'd like to offer a few thoughts, and to organize our thoughts today for the purpose of memory, I'd like to have us think about it this way. Take a look at your hand, right? Take a look at your hand. When you're angry, when you're hurt, you naturally clench your hand into a fist, right? And you want to strike. But forgiveness essentially opens the hand so that the fingers can reach out and embrace. And I'd like to think about that image. 5 fingers opened to embrace, not clenched to strike. The 5 fingers serving to remind us of the 5 key steps of forgiveness. Step 1, little finger. This is where we begin. In forgiveness, the pinky, the smallest finger, should remind us, first of all, that whenever someone hurts us, that however we have been wronged is very small compared to the wrongs that we have committed. This, of course, is what initiates the whole drama of the parable. The slave owes the king a tremendous amount of money. In modern terms, it's about $500 million. Now, how on earth he ran up this debt is unclear, But what is clear is that he can't pay. But out of mercy, the king forgives the debt. The same slave then goes out and he has his friend thrown into jail over basically a $50 debt. It's ridiculous, right? And that's exactly Jesus' point. Jesus is first trying to tell us that this is what our lives are like, that God in Christ Jesus has forgiven us, each of us, a mountain of debt. But then we lash out at tiny little wrongs. Somebody cuts us off in traffic, right? Somebody forgets a basic courtesy. Someone is rude. Someone disagrees with us. Someone dares not be spending their every waking moment thinking only about our needs and our happiness. Right? We go crazy over minutia. I once came upon the following news item from the Palm Beach Press, and it read, "The Spring Haven retirement community in Florida found their peace disrupted over a nasty incident at the salad bar. Mealtime turned ugly after 86-year-old William Hawker complained to 62-year-old Lee Toss about picking through the lettuce. Name-calling soon gave way to punching, and the police were summoned. Those in the way paid a price. One resident was bitten in his attempt to stop the fight, and another knocked down. Toss's own mother, herself a resident, tried to rescue her son. The 80-year-old suffered a severe cut on her arm. While no one was seriously injured, Toss now must find a new place to live." All this over the lettuce in the salad bar, right? But don't we so often do the same, right? We flip out over nothing, Jesus first here, he wants us to take a reality check, right? That the wrongs that have been done to us that we're really upset about, they're tiny. They're almost nothing compared to the tremendous wrongs that we commit every single day that God just keeps on forgiving us for. We need to first get things in perspective and remember our own wrongs and thus be forgiving. As it has been said, if you're struggling to forgive, go to the cross. How does what Jesus did for you compare to all that you're complaining about? Step number 1 in forgiveness, little finger, knowledge that the injury is small compared to all that Jesus has forgiven you. Step 2, ring finger. Right? As its name implies, this is the finger on which we tend to wear jewelry, most notably an engagement, wedding ring, It's the finger that is commonly used to represent the ways in which we are joined to one another. And in forgiveness, this is the second thing that we need to do. We need to remember that we are joined to each other, that most especially that what joins us all together as human beings, namely that we all make mistakes. This, of course, is the second basic fact that drives the entire parable. Got a bunch of people running up debt. These debts representing our wrongs is the way we hurt each other. The whole premise of this parable is that people make mistakes, that they hurt each other, This is the second fact that we have to get into our heads, that we're flawed, that we're weak, and this is a major force that tends to keep people from forgiving. It keeps us all wrapped up in anger and bitterness. We know that we make mistakes, but then we refuse to allow anyone else to do the same. We hold people to a higher standard than we do ourselves. They must never do anything wrong to us. Well, in learning to forgive, secondly, look at your ring finger and remember how we're joined as human beings. And then cut other people a break, Remember that we all make mistakes, that much of life is just by accident. Quit taking it all as being on purpose. They meant to do that, when they probably don't even know what they've done to you, Quit demanding a perfection in others that you yourself do not attain. One scholar puts it this way: one of the simplest yet greatest inventions of all times is the eraser. It's a common item, yet it proclaims a most profound truth. It acknowledges the fact that no one is perfect. Its entire premise is that people make mistakes. It also reminds us that there is hope and new possibility for those who mess up their lives and relationships with others. Next time you see an eraser, remember that people do make mistakes, and forgive that most basic fact of humanity, of which you are a part. Step number 2 in forgiveness, it's the ring finger. Remember that we're all human. Which leads us to step 3, the middle finger, right? Now we're getting to the finger that really means something when you're angry, right? This is the finger which, as we all know, tends to take on great importance when we're hurt. Just drive around New Jersey any day, you'll see this finger a lot, right? In fact, this finger shows up more than any other finger, right? Well, in thinking about how this finger is sometimes used symbolically in such situations, use that image to think about how you are expressing your anger. Or even better, how are you dealing with your injury? When someone hurts us, there are a handful of ways that we generally deal with it. Sometimes we choose the silent treatment. Other times we just distance ourselves from the person. We refuse to have anything to do with them. Other times we just grumble. We complain about the person behind their back, but we never actually take the issue to them, right? So other times we take that kind of a sniping approach, always taking little verbal shots at the other person whenever possible. So other times we devote our energy to thinking up ways to hurt the other person, and sometimes even enacting these thoughts. Now, some of these approaches make us feel really good for a time. It's like I'm reminded of the married couple that had many sharp disagreements, and yet somehow the wife always remained, she stayed calm and collected. One day her husband commented on his wife's restraint. "When I get mad at you," he said, "you never fight back. How do you control your anger?" The wife said, "I work it off by cleaning the toilet." The husband asked, "How does that help?" She said, "Simple. I use your toothbrush." Sometimes it feels really good to work out our anger in hurtful ways. But ultimately we have to ask ourselves, is this really helping us? Think about it. All the common approaches to anger just mentioned may make us feel good for a time, but they keep the anger in control of our lives, right? It holds us and works on us. And is this what we really want? This is a crucial point of the parable. As noted, when we fail to forgive, we imprison ourselves. As it has been said, harboring resentments is like taking poison and waiting for the other guy to die, right? In failing to forgive, we next need to consider, what is this doing to us? Is this really getting us anywhere? Or are we really just hurting ourselves? Even more pointedly, we need to think about that middle finger and ask, how is my approach working for me? Is this the life I want? Is this who I want to be? Do I like what my anger and my bitterness is doing to my life? And if not, then choose to change. Consider the following true news story from a few years ago. Perhaps you recall this news item. One day, a 27-year-old woman from Fort Pierce, Florida, walked into a McDonald's restaurant and ordered a 10-piece McNuggets meal. Now, you know how it is when you're hungry and you have a taste for something particular, and your imagination starts working, and you've got to have just that, right? Well, it appears that this was this hungry woman's situation, and that's when things got difficult for her. The employee behind the counter took the order and received the payment. The employee then discovered that they were out of McNuggets, right? He told the customer that they had run out of McNuggets, and she could have to get something else, from the menu. The customer asked for her money back. The employee said that all sales are final, but that she could have any larger priced item from the menu that she wanted. The customer got angry. She wanted McNuggets, not a Big Mac, not a quarter pounder. She wanted McNuggets, right? She was angry. And as far as she was concerned, this was clearly an emergency, and she knew what you do in an emergency. She took out her cell phone and called 911 to complain. It's absolutely true. Apparently, the 911 workers didn't take her seriously because she had to call 3 times to actually get help. But note the lesson. Anger twists our perspective, right? It makes small things big things and big things small. And even more importantly, when you give into it, it takes life from us rather than give life to us. For as this story concludes, the woman never got her McNuggets, right? But she did later get a $250 fine from the city for misusing 911. The cost of that day to her multiplied 50 times over because of anger, and that's how it works for us as well. Step number 3 in forgiveness, it's the middle finger. How is my anger working for me? Do I like the life it's making, And if not, then choose to change. Which leads us into step number 4, it's the index finger. With this finger, of course, we tend to do a lot of pointing, right? In fact, it's often referred to as the pointer finger, right? And this is symbolic of another major obstacle we've got to overcome in forgiveness. It's pointing at others, always claiming what someone else must do to make things right before we will forgive. Well, if something must be done first, then it's not forgiveness, right? This is the heart of the parable. Notice what the story illustrates. Forgiveness, by definition, involves freely absolving a debt that is rightly due to us. In both cases in the story, money is owed, but when it cannot be repaid, the question for the person owed is, will they demand payment or will they take the debt upon themselves? Not that the debt isn't important, quite the contrary, but only that the relationship, the life, is more important, and they are willing to assume the cost. Simply put, they must give up their rights for there to be life, and that's the point. Forgiveness is surrendering my right to hurt you because you hurt me. It's a choice to leave the injury behind, to say, for me, the debt doesn't exist anymore. It's a crucial step, and if we don't demand this of ourselves, if we don't make this jump, this free choice through Christ's help, as he did for us, refusing anything that argues otherwise, excuses, delays, placing limits, we will never get on to forgiveness and be free to live. Think of it this way. A number of years ago, in one of his books, author Max Lucado, he told the story of Kevin Tunnell, who each week was required to mail $1 to a family that he would rather forget. They sued him for $1.5 million, but settled for $936 to be paid $1 at a time. The family expected the payment each Friday so Tunnell wouldn't forget what had happened on the first Friday of 1982. And that's the day their daughter was killed by Tunnell. Tunnell was convicted of manslaughter and drunken driving. He was 17 and she was 18. Tunnell served a court sentence. He also spent 7 years campaigning against drunk driving, 6 more years than his sentence required. But he kept forgetting to send the $1. The weekly restitution was to last 18 years, $1 a week for 18 years, the 18 years of their daughter's life. Tunnell was to make the checks out to the victim, mail it to her family, and then the money was deposited in a scholarship fund. The family took him to court 4 times for failure to comply. After one appearance, Tunnell spent 30 days in jail. He insisted that he was not defying the order, but rather he was just simply haunted by the girl's death and tormented by the constant reminders. He offered the family 2 boxes of checks covering all the payments plus a year more than required, but they refused. It's not the money they seek, but penance. Quoting the mother, "We want to receive the check every week on time. He must understand we are going to pursue this to the very end. We will go back to court every month if we have to." Says Lucado, "Few would question the anger of this family. Only the naive would think it's fair to leave the guilty unpunished. But I do have one concern. Is 936 payments enough? Not for Tunnell to send, mind you, but for the family to demand. Even when they receive the final payment in the year 2000, will they be at peace? Will the family be able to put the matter at rest? How much is enough? Were you in the family and were Tunnell your target, how many payments would you require? Better stated, in your own anger, how many payments are you requiring?" Notice the point. Tunnell was repentant. He knew he had done wrong, and he lives with it every single day. He gets it. But he, even more the family, remained trapped by this wrong, kept from life because they were insisting on their payment. A payment that won't really do anything in the end anyway. Insisting on our rights doesn't cut it. Only forgiveness does for all involved. Step number 4 in forgiveness is the index finger. Look at that pointing finger. Instead of pointing to your rights, what someone else needs to do, point to yourself and follow the example of Jesus Christ to give up your rights. Choose to leave the injury behind, for it is ultimately a choice. All of which leads us into, finally, step number 5, is the thumb. The thumb, of course, is the most notable among our fingers because it is opposable. Leading us to our final step in forgiveness, it is opposing what our anger wants us to do. Simply put, the final step here is having chosen to leave the injury behind, to now refuse its ways and instead reach out in love. Break the hold of evil by taking hold of grace instead. Take tangible action to oppose what the hurt wants us to do, is what we're talking about here. That this is ultimately most important. It's not just thinking about forgiveness, but enacting it, In each case, what form this needs to take is different, but it must finally take some form in order to actually be forgiveness. Take tangible action to oppose what the hurt wants you to do. Enact forgiveness. Tangibly move toward the person in love. Instead of striking back or judging or condemning or dividing, somehow find a way to enact life for them and for you. Do the very opposite of what your anger wants you to do. In closing, a noted Christian author, a preacher's son, he tells the following story of a lesson he learned from his father about dealing with anger, and he writes, "I watched intently as my little brother was caught in the act. He sat in the corner of the living room, a pen in one hand and my father's brand new hymnal in the other. As my father walked into the room, my brother cowered slightly. He sensed that he had done something wrong. From a distance, I could see that he had opened my father's new hymnal and had scribbled in it the length and breadth of the very first page with a pen. Now, staring at my father fearfully, he and I both waited for his punishment. And as we waited, there was no way we could have known what our father was about to teach us, the deep and lasting lessons about life and family, lessons that continue to become even clearer through the years. My father picked up his prized hymnal, looked at it carefully, without saying a word. Books were precious to him. He was a clergyman and the holder of several degrees. For him, books were knowledge, and yet he loved his children. You could see that he was extremely angry, but he was struggling, and what he did next was remarkable. Instead of punishing my brother, instead of scolding or yelling or reprimanding, my father sat down, he took the pen from my brother's hand, and then he wrote in the hymnal himself, alongside the scribbles John had made, he wrote the following: John's artwork, 1959, age 2. How many times have I looked into your beautiful face and into your warm, alert eyes looking up at me and thanked God for the one who is now scribbled in my new hymnal. You have made the book sacred, as you and your brothers and sisters have made my life. Wow, I thought, this is punishment? The years and the books came and went. My brother John went on to become an artist, with paintings hanging in numerous galleries and private collections. And I can't help but think that it all began that moment when my father chose not to give in to his anger, but to refuse it, to work a gift, not an injury, to the one who had injured him. And in that, the grace of God flourished. Life happened instead of injury. It's a lesson I strive to live myself every single day. The great evangelist Dwight Moody once said, "The one sin that is keeping revival from coming to the church, more lost people from being saved, and more of the blessings of God from coming upon his people is the sin of the unforgiving spirit." This week, whenever anger and annoyance invariably seeks to overtake you, or as you struggle with some long-standing injury, instead of clenching your fist, open your hand and look at your fingers and remember the 5 steps of forgiveness. Acknowledge that the injury is small compared to what all that Christ has forgiven you. Remember that we are joined, that we're all human, we're all flawed. Ask, how is my anger working for me? Instead of pointing at others, point to yourself and allow Jesus to take charge of the injury. And then finally, tangibly oppose what your anger wants of you today. Do the opposite. Work life. Instead of a fist, reach out to embrace. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 2171 in the black hymnal, "Make Me a Channel of Your Peace." Would you please stand?